Dr. Sophie Bellenis and Lyndsay Wood, who are on our transition team at NESCA. Both are occupational therapists and are here today to present to you. Just wanted to let you know we will be having a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So feel free to add your questions into the Q&A feature down at the bottom, which is enabled for this webinar. If you have any kind of technical difficulties or other questions that are not related to the presentation, feel free to put those into the chat. But we will be getting to those questions at the end of the webinar. And I will hand this over to Dr. Bellenis, who will introduce herself, and Dr. Wood as well, and then we'll get right into the presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Jane. As Jane said, my name is Sophie Bellenis. I'm an occupational therapist by training, and I am on the transition team here at NESCA. I wear a couple hats. I do some direct educational occupational therapy assessment. I do some transition assessment, and I run our executive function and real life skills coaching programs. I wanted to give you a little bit of background just because we're going to be really delving into OT in schools about kind of where I've worked and what I've done. So I've worked in public schools at the elementary, middle school, high school, and post-secondary program levels. So I've sort of worked K through post-12 with all sorts of different students, both in general education and in sub-separate classrooms. I've done a little bit of work in schools that are specifically for students on IEPs in special education, but that is more Dr. Wood's wheelhouse. So I will hand it over to Lyndsay to give a little bit of her background as well.
Yeah, so I'm Lyndsay Wood. Again, I'm an occupational therapist by trade as well, and a transition specialist at NESCA. What I do at NESCA, I'm on the real life skills coaching team. So I'm doing executive function coaching, both in person and virtually. I also do life skills coaching. Most of that is in person in the community. And my background is I worked in a specialized school for autism primarily as an occupational therapist there.
All right, so let's jump in. I'm going to share my screen. I am not the most tech savvy person you'll ever meet, but I do my best. So here we go. And then if I put this in this view, can everybody see this?
Looks
yes?
good to me.
Looks good to you? Okay. All right. Wondering if I can, oh, sorry. All right, well, we will dive right in then. So, oh wait. Sorry, I don't know how to go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. So our objectives for today, we are going to define school-based occupational therapy, which sounds like it might be basic, but it's a little bit more complex than I would say most people's first thought. We will review what comprehensive OT evaluation looks like in the school setting. I often tend to think of it as a more comprehensive and more really in-depth eval than what we would first expect. We will discuss specific areas of focus for elementary, middle, and high school. We will learn about the step-up years and some of the important things to think of during those years. And then we will discuss when pediatric clinic-based OT is needed and how that kind of aligns with school-based occupational therapy. So we'll jump right in.
All right, so first I just want to give you the definition as AOTA, the American Occupational Therapy Association, defines school-based therapy. So they define it as practitioners who support academic achievement and social participation by proponing occupation within all school routines, including recess, classroom, cafeteria. So they're helping children fulfill their role as a student and prepare them for college, career, and community. So what this breaks down to is we're not just helping with academics, we're helping students reach their academic goals, but also functional goals so that they can access their education and their school life. So that part is really important because I think a lot of people think that we're just supporting academics, and that's really not the case. We're supporting academics, but they also need to be able to access their education, access the school itself. And I'm gonna go into some of those examples in a minute. So we utilize the PEO model, which stands for person, environment, and occupation. And as an OT, we really look at the total picture. So we're not just looking at your student, your child, and maybe their strengths and challenges and deficits. It's important to look at the whole picture. So yes, we're looking at your child and some of their strengths and their skills that they're bringing to the table, but it's also really, really important to look at the environment. What's their classroom setup? Are they seated in the front or the back of the room? Are there options for alternative seating in the classroom? Is there a huge sensory overload in this classroom? Is there noise? Are there kids running all around? Are there loud sounds, maybe loud vents, a loud AC? So we're thinking about the entire picture to figure out how they're performing. How are they performing these necessary occupations or activities that they need to do at school? So we're taking into account all of this. So now I just want to break it down and tell you a little bit about some of the occupations we may be looking at. So riding the bus. When you think about riding the bus, it's not just riding the bus. You need to get to the bus on time. You need to get up the stairs of the bus. You need to be able to do your buckle. So you need the fine motor skills for that. The sensory experience on a bus can be extremely overwhelming. There's tons of kids. There's lots of talking, the social interaction on a bus. So as OTs, we're really thinking about each of those things that your student has to do to be successful in school and breaking that down and figuring out where's the barrier, what's the issue, what's going wrong, and how can we support your students so they're successful. So riding a bus is just one example. Unpacking a backpack, sitting through morning meeting, and then writing. OTs, you probably think, okay, OTs, you're the handwriting people, right? Yes. We are the handwriting people, but we do a number of other things: navigating the building, playing at recess, helping with supporting eating lunch in the cafeteria, using your iPad and Chromebook, playing in band, PE, going to the bathroom, manipulating manipulatives in math. So there's lots of different occupations that students have to engage in throughout the day that as OTs we can support so they are successful.
I'm going to jump in a little bit about where this comes from. So students who qualify for occupational therapy services should have access to them, and that is based on the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act from 2004. I thought I'd just pull the language directly from IDEA to give a little bit of a overview of what they directly say. OT is listed as one of many services that students are entitled to. Other examples you might know of are speech language pathology or physical therapy, audiology, counseling services. And this is the language specifically for OTs. So it's improving, developing, or restoring functions impaired or lost through illness, injury, or deprivation, improving ability to perform tasks for independent functioning. So that goes back to where Lyndsay was really talking about that function piece. It's not just that academics. And then preventing through early intervention, initial or further loss of function. So there is a maintenance, skill maintenance allowance there as well. And overall, this is based on the educational model. So this is what do we need to access education holistically. So how do we figure out if a student needs OT? This is for both an initial evaluation and a 3-year reevaluation, and it really should be quite in depth. I will say that not every assessment I read looks like this. Not every assessment includes all of these really important factors, but I would say that they should. Even if it's just like checking a box, this doesn't really apply to this student. So, the 3 big areas that we tend to really focus in on are visual skills, fine motor skills in general, fine and gross motor, and sensory. Those are sort of those standardized assessments of what's a student's foundational skill. That's looking at the P piece of that PEO model, that person. What is the person's skill? What are they coming to the classroom with? And then the other things that we really need to take into account and should be part of the evaluation are an observation across settings. So that's the E part. What's their environment like? Is there anything that's making accessing academic curriculum more difficult in a specific setting. So I like to see observation not just in the classroom, but maybe one in the classroom, one in the cafeteria. How's the student reacting? How's the student being impacted by environment? An educational record review, just to see if there's any patterns that stand out, anything that really jumps out at a student or at an OT based on the student's historical profile. Interview with teacher and parent. That's where we're going to get a lot of our best information from the people who see them every day. Review of work samples, and then just an assessment of function and performance. Just looking at a specific task, how does the student perform on it? What's everything looking about like? So this is like very specific standardized assessment and just the observational piece that needs to come together to get an accurate picture of a student. Because while some students might be able to, pass the foundational skills with flying colors, once you throw them in an environment with other students, they might not be able to demonstrate those skills at all. So we really want to get this really well-rounded view that takes into account multiple factors. I'm going to talk a little bit about the progression of OT through the academic career, because what we're really focusing on today is what does OT look like after elementary school, which is where everyone's mind goes. So elementary school is where we start, and where we should start, hopefully. We want to be evaluating students as early as possible, getting them services as early as you can, because a lot of these motor skills, the ideal period to focus on them is early, developmentally. So we want to get these kids in early, and this is what's the most well-known. It's handwriting. That's where people's mind go, as Lyndsay said, but there's a lot more that really needs to be touched on. There's the visual motor integration. There's visual perception, so being able to look at worksheets, being able to look at all sorts of things and understand them visually. There's endurance and strength. Our kids tend to fatigue, and that's absolutely something OTs can work on. And then a huge piece is sensory regulation and strategies in that area. I would say that based on my experience, students are provided this piece. This piece is often caught. Teachers have a great grasp on who to refer to OT. They know their students. They know who needs this help. And this is where we really catch kids and they get the services. What I want to keep talking about is where we start losing kids in OT and where we could really do to keep them on and keep them benefiting from OT services. So middle school OT intervention. We're going to talk about all three of these buckets more in depth, but the things that I see as like the big need, Dr. Wood and I both see, is needing to really have an emphasis on using assistive tech and building up digital literacy. We live in a digital world, much more digital than when I was in middle school. So it's really important that students understand the executive function piece of digital literacy, the fine motor piece of digital literacy, all sorts of things that go into being a digital citizen. The visual demands increase in math class, and I'll give some really concrete examples of this, but I've seen lots of students have trouble passing specific units. So when we look at that occupation piece, it's really specific units that are quite visually based, and what it ends up coming down to is like, oh, that student just didn't do very well on that unit. When I look at it more deeply, it's because of visual skills that can be accommodated for and mediated for. And then this self-care, life skill, regulation skills. These things continue into middle school. Students are not mastering them in elementary school, nor should they be expected to. And there's a lot of work that can continue to be done. So to go a little bit more specifically into that kind of assistive tech and digital literacy, with all of the platforms that are popping up, this need just becomes more and more important. And the most important, well, that's bold. One of the most important things in my mind is this typing speed. And I'll go into it kind of really specifically here. So Massachusetts state guidelines say that a student should be typing at 5 times their grade level per minute. So if you're in first grade, you should be typing 5 words per minute. If you're in 5th grade, you should be typing 25 words per minute. And that goes through to senior year, which is 12th grade, where you should be aiming to type at 60 words per minute, which is a very functional adult typing speed for a career. Do all kids hit that? No. But if we're getting kids hitting around 45 to 65 words per minute, they're going to be able to get by, and that's going to be a really functional typing speed for them. We tend to think of our students as really good at this kind of stuff because they've had access to technology since such an early age. But the reality is that they type with their thumbs. And they might be faster at typing with their thumbs than they are with typing with a keyboard. And they may have developed some really poor habits, like the hunt and peck method. And what I've talked to a lot of kind of administrators and parents about is that this has a really substantial effect on standardized testing. I had been in contact with 2 separate districts that were about 8 miles apart in Massachusetts. And one of them, their average 5th grader was typing at 25 words per minute. So the Massachusetts state level, that was what most of the students were meeting. In the other district, 5th graders were typing at about 10 words per minute. So the students in the first district were typing 2.5 times faster. And this has an enormous effect on standardized testing. And if if I'm writing an essay and I'm given 2 hours and I can type 2.5 times faster than the student in the district across, I'm getting a lot more on that paper, and it doesn't necessarily mean that I know anything more about writing and the writing process. It just means that I'm getting more words down and I'm able to put together a more comprehensive paper. So this is really important, and this has long-lasting effects. And things are becoming more and more digital. So I just want to put in the plug for typing speed. It's important. I think it should be embedded in any curriculum for all students, and in a lot of districts it is. And in some districts it's not, and I think it's something that should be a priority. So for our students who get to 5th grade and they're typing at 10 words per minute, they're not done. And if it's related to a fine motor disability, this is absolutely something that an occupational therapist should be focusing on really heavily, or providing assistive tech accommodation that makes it so that they're typing at an appropriate level in comparison to their peers.
So just some more on digital literacy and diving into the specifics. I mean, as Sophie said, digital literacy is our ability to access the digital world, whether it's the internet, whether it's our email, whether it's just being able to use a word processor. Digital literacy is everywhere. We use it every day, so it's extremely important. And middle school is a great time to continue to develop those skills, and they need to be developed.
Sorry.
So one of the things that OTs can do in middle school is help with organization. As students are entering middle school, the demands are getting higher. There's higher expectations for keeping organized. There's more documents that they're writing that they have to keep organized. And I've worked with a lot of students who, when we go in and we look at their files, it's chaos. It's total, absolute chaos. They can't find a thing. They'll just type something, save it, and to the ether, they have no idea where it is. So one thing that's really important to work with students on is setting up digital organization. We need to figure out, okay, let's set up some folders that'll work for you. Let's break everything into subjects. Let's break it into years so that you are able to find everything. And teachers are using different programs. They're using Google Calendar, they're using Canvas, Seesaw. So we can also support students in understanding how to optimize these programs so that they can be as successful as possible. And especially when you have a disability, it's incredibly important. So other OT demands related to digital learning, visual tracking deficits. I mean, the digital space can be extremely overwhelming visually. So as OTs, we can help students in those middle school years to figure out how to utilize technology in a way to make up for any deficits or fatigue. We can help them with their keyboarding skills and developing those keyboarding skills to get to that level. That typing speed, as Sophie was talking about, is so important. We can set up adaptive equipment. Maybe they're going to have to use voice to type. Like maybe they're going to have to use alternative mouse, maybe an alternative keyboard. And we can assess these things and figure out what's going to be best for your child, for your students, so they can be successful in school and feel good about themselves and feel good about what they're producing. And then there's the executive function demands of digital learning. This can be a number of things. I mean, I mentioned organization before, setting up those folders, making sure your email's organized. Email becomes even more important as you get older. Also making visual guides for new software. I have had a number of clients and students I've worked with who they just can't figure out the process of logging into their email. So let's make a visual guide. Let's take screenshots. So we're going to take screenshots of the steps to log into your email and how to check it. We'll make a whole visual guide, and I'll often do it with the student so I can figure out, okay, what's going to be the most helpful? Is this the screenshot that you need? Like, is this where the breakdown is? Oh yeah, I always forget that step. Okay, let's get a screenshot of that. So we work closely with the students to set up something that works for them so that they can use it, and then they feel good about, now I know how to check my email. I have this guide here. I'm going to use that and I'll check my email. So we do a lot of things related to executive functioning.
So number 2 for middle school, I'm going to jump back to that visual demand piece I spoke about. So geometry is really where I see it mostly start to come in, and tracking things across graphs and charts, the mental manipulation. I have a picture example of what that is on the next slide. And then there's a huge increase of number of problems on the page. So you might be looking at a page with like 100 questions, which is very visually overwhelming. And then this is where we start to see a combination of letters and numbers in the same problem, with letters representing numbers that we don't know yet. And that can just be hugely visually overwhelming. I think it's really important if a student has demonstrated like visual perception or visual motor deficits in elementary school to be reassessing at a middle school level to see if this is going to be impacted. So this is just like a page I like to use as an example of what middle school math starts to look like. That bottom example is actually from an old MCAS question. So if you look at this, you're seeing different shapes, you're seeing mirrored shapes, you're seeing lowercase letters in the example. On the top right, we're seeing letters and numbers and lines and colors. And then, so all of that's just really visually overwhelming. The one at the bottom here, the question was which of these 2D figures would fold up into a cube? The answer is 4. But that all has to be done mentally. It's mental manipulation. And not all of our students have the ability to do that. Unless they spend a pretty substantial amount of time with physical manipulations. In elementary school, teachers use a lot of physical manipulations or manipulatives. They bring them in, students play with them, they see how things will work. It's multi-sensory learning. In middle school, sometimes that happens. Sometimes it doesn't. For a student with a visual deficit, it has to happen in order for this stuff to make any sense. So if it's not happening in a classroom, that is something that an occupational therapist should be brought in to help a student with a visual deficit figure out how to access. How can we work with the student in a multisensory way to help them understand, so when they see that question on MCAS, they can figure out how to answer it. This is tricky stuff and it gets complex very fast. The amount of time that it takes a student to go from 5 + 5 to mirroring triangles of ABC is unreal. They learn so quickly. And some of our students just really need that extra OT support to understand what's going on visually.
So this area is kind of my soapbox, I guess I would say. When students go from elementary school to middle school, as Sophie mentioned, often OT services are taken away. And when you think about what happens when you go from elementary to middle school, that's when you're starting to have all these new hormones in your body, right? So you're having these raging hormones. You're entering a totally new school. And all of a sudden, what are your self-regulation skills magically perfect? No, definitely not. So I think it's extremely, extremely important to have OT services for those students who have difficulties with self-regulation, continue to receive OT services as they enter middle school. They need to figure out, in this new environment, with these raging hormones, with my changing body, with the changing social dynamics change so much when you get into middle school. And so being able to regulate and keep yourself regulated is hard, and you might need support. Also, you start to feel stigmatized. A lot of students we work with, they start to get embarrassed about the tools that they're using to regulate. So maybe we need to figure out some new strategies that they're comfortable with using that feel more age appropriate, something that's a little more subtle. Maybe other students won't notice. So OT is so important to help these students figure out, okay, how can I regulate in this new environment, in my new body, with new strategies so I don't feel embarrassed. It's incredibly important. The other area is life skills. Students aren't magically great at life skills once they enter junior high. A lot of students aren't, and students with disabilities are often, even further behind. They still need support in developing those life skills as they relate to accessing their education. They still, in this new building, they might not be able to navigate the new building. They may need support as they enter this new space. They may still need support with a lot of things they were still working on in elementary school, because it takes longer for them to build those skills. So they should still be receiving those direct services so they can continue to build those skills that they were working on. We don't want them to fade away. We want to continue to build them up. And this can be provided both in substantially separate programs, but also in general education. And I think that's really important that it is provided in general education as well.
All right, so that's kind of our middle school 3 big buckets that we think are important to focus on. When we move to high school, some things stay the same, some things change. So let's jump into it. The reality is that at this point, a fair amount of students have moved to a consult model and have been taken off of direct services. That being said, it's really important to figure out how those consults are working. They can't just be a quick check-in. I think there really needs to be some intentional tracking and monitoring of our students maintaining these skills in a new environment. And if they're not, do we need to reevaluate and get back on direct services? And they should really be collaborative and across settings. Students, especially in high school, are all over the place. They have a different teacher for every subject. They're in the building. Some students are outside of the building. They're doing different things. We really want to make sure that if a student has OT consult, they are checking in and they are really getting a comprehensive picture of how the student's doing in the whole environment, not just in one classroom. Kind of going back to what Lyndsay said, skills required in middle school often still need to be targeted in high school. A lot of our kids still haven't figured out those self-regulation skills and are again thrown into a new environment. And it just might not be time for them to try and do this all independently. And then back to digital literacy, those needs just keep going up. They just keep increasing, and they will keep increasing substantially kind of past high school as well. But we need to make sure that the access is there. So I know I spoke a little bit about this just with specific relation to typing speed, but our online testing systems have pretty much all become digital. The SAT is headed that way. It's being piloted for international students in 2023, so next year. And then for students here, it'll be starting in 2024. I'm very interested to see what that looks like and how that's going to be administered and sort of how that's going to impact our students. And then the online system for MCAS has been around for a while at this point. Just a suggestion to providers who might be here, I would really suggest going to look at those practice tests that are available every year from the state and intentionally seeing how those questions might affect your students. Sometimes they're great, and sometimes there's a lot of fine and visual motor needs that are not necessarily taken into account when formatting the questions. And I would say that there are quite a few questions that are testing kind of both math and digital literacy. Can you drag? Can you plot on a graph by connecting dots with your mouse? Things like that that just add complexity. There's the continued typing speed effect. If a student's, not building that skill early, then it sort of becomes compounded as other students get faster and faster and faster, and our students sort of plateau. So that really needs to be targeted. And then just that high digital literacy need of needing to log in and all that stuff can just be fatiguing early on in the testing process. So practicing that kind of stuff a few times. But this is a real need. This is something that really stands out and only gets compounded at the high school level.
So then we also want to start thinking about transition planning. You want to do this early. The year the student turns 14 in Massachusetts, that's when we're thinking about transition planning. So doing it early is important. I've seen students who haven't really started transition planning till they're 18. And it's like, yikes, you may be about to leave high school. What's the plan? What's next? Like, we want to start this early so we can figure out what supports need to be in place to build you to a point that you're going to be successful. What services should you access outside of school to help you be successful? So first, it's important to have an assessment. Let's assess these skills. Let's look at your self-care skills, your domestic skills, community activities you're involved in. What's your voc knowledge? Because all of these pieces are so important for life after high school. We need to figure out, what is that vision? What's the vision that you have for yourself, for the students, so they feel fulfilled and they feel like they're going to have a great, wonderful life, so they feel empowered. So that's what we're trying to figure out, and we're trying to figure out how to make it happen. In the need for handwriting, that doesn't disappear. So that's an important area as well to target, because think about, as adults in the adult world, yes, it's very digital. However, if you're at work, you may need to jot down a note, right? If someone tells you something that you have to remember, oh, let me jot down a note. Maybe you're at a place that still has a written application, or at least part of it's written. You just have to write that out. Maybe signatures. You're going to have to sign a lot of things. So the need for handwriting does not disappear, and that's an important piece of transition planning, so that you can be as independent as possible, as independent as you want to be once you transition.
Lyndsay, can I go off of that quickly?
Yeah.
So absolutely. And the IEP goals can look different. It doesn't have to be, we'll type 3 complete sentences of an introductory paragraph, or we'll handwrite 3 sentences. We can really get specific here. We'll put together a legible signature and date for a job application, can fill out a job application within the provided limits. Like, we can really look at what handwriting will be needed based on a transition plan that has a goal or a career path, and figure out, okay, so what's the student going to actually have to be doing? And how can we incorporate that into that section?
Yep. So I think OTs, as we have in the slide, OTs are often underutilized in this process. We just have a unique perspective to be able to help support all these different areas that are so important for, post-secondary life. And I think it's important that OTs are incorporated more at this level to help with the transition process.
All right, so I'm going to go to that phrase I used at the beginning, the step-up years, that I didn't quite define, but we have talked about it. So these are the years where we're switching from either elementary to middle, elementary to junior high, or middle to high, junior high to high. They're typically in Massachusetts between 5th and 6th, or between 8th and 9th. That's not always consistent. I strongly believe that we should never discontinue direct services during a step-up year. We are changing everything about this kid's environment, expectation, all of it. And so we have this huge increase in demand. What they're being expected to do and learn and navigate is substantially larger because their habits and routines and familiar faces that they've been relying on for the last however many years just disappear. So I very strongly would reject any proposal to discontinue services during this little step up year. And that really does go back to the foundation of OT. So PEO model, person, environment, occupation. When you switch buildings, the only thing that's staying consistent, kind of, is person. But Lyndsay gave us some great examples of why that doesn't really stay consistent when we take into account developmental change, hormonal change, puberty, all of that. It doesn't really stay the same, but for argument's sake. Environment and occupation are substantially changing. So we have a whole new different level of performance that we can't predict. So these step-up years are just really important to keep services provided and consistent so that students aren't trying to do this on their own, because that's just really tricky. And we're sort of setting them up for failure if we pull services and increase demand simultaneously.
So we just want to quickly touch on clinic-based services and what those are. So clinic-based services, this is services outside of school. So they typically use a medical model instead of a school model. And this is something covered through health insurance, so it's not covered through your school. Again, I said it's provided outside of school hours at a private clinic. And they're targeting functions across different environments. So they're thinking about home setting, thinking about school setting, thinking about the community. So it's a little bit more comprehensive across all environments. And then typically the things that are focused on in these private clinics are some of the sensory and maybe motor deficits. Again, more of that medical model is the focus for these clinics.
And a lot of things that are covered on an IEP as part of a transition plan are not going to be covered by a health insurance plan. You know, a lot of that transition focused community access that OTs can be involved with at a school setting, that's not really what's going to be focused on at a clinic. That's really focusing on like the sensory and motor piece.
So when should you access? I mean, it's always worth getting an evaluation. It can always be helpful to have an outside provider working in conjunction with some of the school-based services. It's good to get that outside perspective and maybe help with some generalization across settings. So that can be important, an important piece of having an outside provider and working on some slightly different things that the school can't work as intensively on. You can have intensive work on some of maybe those motor deficits and sensory processing issues. The clinic can really help with that piece.
So essentially, we're big fans. But it might not be for every kid. It's worth exploring. And it definitely doesn't replace school-based occupational therapy. So I am going to just jump in and give a little rundown of what we offer here at NESCA. Because while we do not do clinic-based OT, we do provide some services that can really help access the school-based or supplement some of the school-based OT. So we do educational occupational therapy assessments. So if you think back to earlier in the presentation, we had that comprehensive evaluation. Sometimes you're going to get a beautiful school evaluation with a neat little bow that covers all of those and really goes into like everything listed there. And sometimes you aren't. And sometimes you're going to need to get some outside perspective. So we do educational OT assessments where we look into all of those areas. We get in touch with all sorts of professionals that work with a child. We really do that kind of in-depth assessment. We're happy to attend IEP meetings to provide reports to schools or families and just really say like, you know, this is how we think school OT could help this student and provide a bit of a another perspective on what would be beneficial for a student. We do functional assessment of home and community-based skills for 5th grade and older students. I would say this is often done for students who it's not quite clear how they are accessing the community or how they will do in navigating an independent setting. An example, I've done a bunch of evaluations of students on college campuses because there's a lot of things that come into play to navigating what it means to be new on a college campus. Example I always use that really was eye-opening for me was that I was at with a student and we had a campus map and we were, navigating to a dorm and to the library and seeing what the dining hall was like. And this student couldn't find the dorm, and it was because on the map, the donor for the building's last name was listed, and on the building, the donor's first and last name was listed. And it's just those little pieces of visual data that are too tricky. And it gives us a really good glimpse into problem solving, into navigating the community, into looking into their resources independently. Is a student going to pull out their phone and try and do some sleuthing, or are they going to kind of freeze? So those are kind of what our functional assessments look like. And then we have our coaching programs. So real life skills coaching is focused on kind of experiencing the community and learning some of those community skills and home skills that are really important. We do a lot of training with Uber and Lyft. We do some public transportation training. We might work with a student to plan an outing. So they're planning, I want to go here, I want to go get lunch here, and they might be setting a budget and setting a sort of like a time budget, figuring out what are their management strategies in the moment, what needs to be prepared ahead of time. So it's a lot of just real world, real life skill practice and training. We do have executive function coaching, which focuses both on that digital piece and just kind of the physical world piece of executive function. The EF demand just gets more and more. And by the time students are at college, they are navigating so many systems, all sorts of things, especially if they're receiving accommodations academically. We see a huge increase in what they're responsible for. So, a student in high school has an IEP and all their teachers have read it, hopefully. And, they all know what they're able to have for accommodations and what their goals are and what they're working toward. Once a student's in college, the onus is really on the student, and they need to find the student accessibility office, and they need to bring letters of accommodation to all of their professors, and they need to ask those questions. And then our transition specialists do a lot of transition consultation and coaching directly related to those services we talked about in the transition planning. So how are we coming up with a comprehensive plan that really looks at all aspects that students should be provided support with in accessing their academics and functionally accessing their education. We have OTs that help students build their ADLs and IADLs. ADLs are our skills like brushing your teeth, all sorts of things like that. And then IADLs are things like laundry and more of those cooking skills, things that happen not necessarily every single day, but are an important part of life to be able to be independent. Oh, wait. I may have jumped ahead. I apologize. Probably should have had this slide up when I was talking about real life skills coaching. But again, they're highly individualized. It's all one-on-one. They're very goal-based. We incorporate EF. And often these are skills that aren't targeted in school or are really tricky for parents to target. I say to parents sometimes, I will probably say a lot of the same things that you do. It will just be received very differently. Luckily that can be collaborative. We do consultation to parents as well.
And also too, I've talked with schools and helped with that generalization. The school will tell me some of the things that they're working on within the school. And then I'll try and transition it to home because parents are having more difficulty transitioning some of that, bringing some of those skills home. So I'll help support and try and use the same system that they're using at school and use it across contexts.
Absolutely. So these are all the things that we tend to focus on. I can just leave that up for people to review: IADLs, job and volunteer, self-advocacy, EF, financial literacy, community navigation, and then that college campus training or assessment that I talked about. So that is the end of kind of our spiel on middle school and high school OT and how, you know, while we are pretty good at teaching handwriting, it's not all that we need to be focusing on. I believe do we have questions, Jane?
We do. We have a slew of them.
All right.
What do you suggest that we do when requesting an evaluation or reviewing an evaluation if the school-based OT says that gross motor is something that PTs evaluate and that it's not expected for OT?
I would ask for a PT evaluation, honestly. You know, I think that teams are pretty collaborative. I would like it to be touched on. I do agree that gross motor is in depth evaluated by the physical therapist at the school. I always touch on it in an evaluation just to make sure I don't see anything substantial. An example of something that pops up a lot is middle school boys haven't developed any core strength yet. So they all sit like this and they all kind of lie down on their table. And I would want that type of thing really noted if that was happening in a class, and if they're fatiguing. But I mean, if that's the case, let's get a PT evaluation and let's get some consultation between OT and PT to make sure the student can access.
Great. And regarding visual, perceptual, visual motor skills and their relation to math, do you have resources you can share on how to support and or help them with remediation in this area?
So it's so individualized. And this is why I think it can't necessarily just be like a response to intervention or a whole class initiative. Because these deficits are so specific that I find that the OT really needs to work like one-on-one. And my two big suggestions tend to be bring in colors. So a lot of students might have a hard time with all the black and white lines, but if they're having to match up red and blue, even with wiki sticks, like wiki sticks are developmentally appropriate for middle school if you're putting them along graph lines and things like that. Bringing in colors is really helpful. And then just manipulatives and having students cut things out. Let them cut up those worksheets and, you know, figure out, okay, this does match. But it really might need to be done one-on-one. And that's why I see the role of the OT is so important, because that mental manipulation isn't going to get there until it's seen physically many times. And often we just don't have time for that in a math class. And so the students end up, you know, doing so poorly on that unit, but doing great on the next unit. And when you really evaluate those units, it's a visual deficit that's making the issue.
When should typing be evaluated for the first time, and who on the team should be doing that evaluation?
Such a tricky question because it totally depends on the district. So some districts, it's done by the library tech teacher. I think that that's a pretty good model. And that's when there's a comprehensive like program built in, and that starts in kindergarten. You know, that's starting really early. I would say that by second or third grade, you want to know what a student's typing at. And the biggest piece of that is like we're developmentally primed to learn touch typing that young. And if we're not taught it, we're going to start to hunt and peck. And we're going to go like this. And then you're going to be in 7th grade saying, no, I'm faster doing this. Yes, you are faster doing that, but you're going to hit a ceiling and you're never really going to be able to type faster than maybe 25 or 30 words per minute. You know, so we need to pull in all the fingers to do touch typing. So it's tricky to give a baseline because it depends on how they're being taught. But it's kind of something I would check in with every year. And it's less like, when do I evaluate its speed? It's let's make sure a student's being taught a functional method from the start. If you come in and assess it at 5th grade and they're typing at 10 words per minute, then we needed a remediation plan. But it really should be comprehensive starting very young. And then you don't necessarily have to keep teaching it, right? If a kid's typing at 25 words per minute in 5th grade, they'll probably just hit 60 words per minute by senior year because they're typing so much. So again, sorry, my answers aren't particularly concrete, but I would say if the student is in a comprehensive program, it should be being evaluated consistently. If a student hasn't been taught any comprehensive program, start assessing as early as you can.
Great. Is there an evaluation tool that you use to assess life skills at the high school level?
So I think there's a lot of different things. One thing that I often like to do, I like to do a lot of informal evaluations because each child is so unique. So if I'm in person doing an evaluation, I'll often look at their different life skills and write my own observations. There's also tools you can use, like you can have students, parents, teachers fill out like an ABAS to get a sense of where the student's at. So that can be something you do as well. But I don't only like to get that data. I like to observe myself. I think it's really important to go in and see what's actually happening. But you can do something like an ABAS to get information about the students functioning from a lot of different members of the team and from the student themselves. But I think the observation is so crucial to see where some of those breakdowns are.
A Vineland is another
Vineland, yeah, that's
example. Yeah, I like the ABAS more too, but another example people like. So yeah, there are a lot of different tools, but I agree with Lyndsay that it sort of needs to be two-pronged. You want that outside data, but you want to see things yourself.
And if my son had an OT evaluation at school, but I'm not sure if it was complete or if the recommendations made make sense based on the testing, will you do a consultation to help me know if the testing was appropriate?
Absolutely. We can definitely review school-based testing. We can look into it. You know, sometimes I find that I think the testing was complete, but I would have given really different recommendations. And sometimes we find that the testing is missing some pieces that are pretty imperative to getting an accurate picture. That is definitely something that we both do. We would both be happy to do. And so we can do, you know, we can do another evaluation ourselves, or we can really just do that consultation model, which can be really helpful because, you know, the reality is that OT evaluations kind of just look like a bunch of jargon if you don't really know what it's assessing. We can do our very best to explain every single term and have that embedded in the report, and I promise. But you know, having that conversation is pretty important to understand in depth really what's going on in there, and what each phrase means and what that might mean both foundationally and functionally.
And how do the services at NESCA work for real life skills coaching? Is it a package of sessions, or is it like a month or 2-month type of arrangement? How do you determine that for each student?
Yeah, so I always say, you know, there's no guaranteed amount of time we can give that it will take to teach a student a skill. So we bill things hourly. It is all one-on-one, and we work based on an hourly model. So some sessions could be 3 hours. We could do a 40-minute planning session, and that's all based on communication between families and the clinician who's directly working with the student. Sometimes we'll do intensives, you know, an April vacation intensive where we do 10 hours of direct services over April, or some students are home from college and have skills they want to bolster in the summer. So it's all billed hourly, which gives us some flexibility to really target what a student needs.
Great. And I think, let's see, we might have one more. Can you give some examples of structures for coaching for students who have RLS coaching weekly?
Sure. So
Real
it's
life,
interesting
though.
because I think that, yes, that's the real life coaching or the executive function coaching. I would say that I have clients who I meet with 3 times a week for 30 minutes. And those are my clients who really need to build habits and really need to build routines. And what we are working on is figuring out what works for them and then building it into part of their schedule. This is often my college students who have gone from a place that had tons of cushions and tons of help and support, and now they're sort of navigating things independently, and we need to get systems in place that are going to be sustainable, and we need to get strategies in place that are going to work. So we meet pretty frequently. We absolutely have students who are doing more of that, like direct understanding their own executive function or understanding where their skill levels lie. That is an hour a week. And then we do both virtual and in-person services. So the 3 times 30 I was talking about would be a virtual model. Sometimes we'll do, an afternoon a week for a 3-hour trip to Boston. And that might include a 30-minute planning session at the beginning of the week. So that might be a 30-minute to an hour-long meeting on Monday to plan it all out. And then we meet up and we actually do it. It's experiential learning. We see where a student succeeds. We see where a student really needs some more help. I had a student once where I was on the T in Boston and we were doing a scaffolded approach. So we had ridden the T together many times. And the next step on that was that we would ride the T in separate cars. We were going to go one stop and we were going to get off. And I went one stop in my car and I got off and he called me and he said, "Oh, we forgot to get off the train." I said, "Well, I didn't forget to get off the train. I got off the train." And it was a great learning opportunity. He got off at the next stop. I said, "I'm going to come meet you, but by the time I get there, I want to know what our plan is to get back." And by the time I got there, he had figured out that it was actually faster to walk than it would be to get back on and take the T back. And it's learning in the moment, and we give kids the experience of their own problem solving and figuring out how they're gonna do these things in the real world, because that's the goal, right? The goal is independence. But the models are quite different, so it's hard. Those are just a couple examples. Lyndsay, I don't know if you have a good example of how you work with a student kind of in the program.
Yeah, I mean, it's all different. Like you said, I have one student who I'm only meeting for 15 minutes a few times a week because we've already built up a lot of skills. So he's been with me for a while, but now he's gotten to a point where he just needs some check-ins. Like, he has a good system in place. He's figured out what tools he needs to use, but he just needs some 15-minute check-ins. So with him, I'll just do 2 or 3 15-minute check-ins during the week, and then he's good to go. He's able to stay on top of things. So it's important too, like, we may start very intensive, but then just start to fade it. Like, as the skills are building up, we're fading back until they don't need us anymore, because that's the goal.
All right, and I think that wraps up the questions. We will make this presentation available on our website at www.nesca-newton.com under the resources tab, and that should be up there within the next day or so. And thank you everyone for participating and taking the time to be here today. And thank you to Drs. Bellenis and Wood.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for coming.